The heat shimmering off the cracked earth of Redemption, Arizona, made the distant mesas wobble like a drunkard's dream. It was a town built on desperation and dust, clinging to the promise of a railroad line, the way a dying man clings to a last prayer. Inside the dim, cool air of the general store, the scent of canvas coffee beans and licorice was a temporary reprieve from the oppressive glare of the afternoon sun. Elias Vance ran a calloused thumb over a bolt of sturdy denim, his mind 1,000 miles and 10 years away. He was a ghost here, a man named Miller, who kept to himself, fixed what was broken, and never met anyone's gaze for too long. His past was a locked room, and he had thrown away the key. Then the world outside shattered. Glass exploded from the bank across the street, a sound like a thunderclap in the oppressive stillness. A woman's scream followed, sharp and jagged. Elias froze his hand, hovering over a sack of flour. Every instinct honed over a lifetime he fought to forget, screamed at him to draw the worn Colt Navy tucked into his waistband. But a stronger voice, a promise whispered over a shallow grave, held him in place. No more. Not ever again. He was done with guns and ghosts. He pressed himself back into the shadows between a pickle barrel and a stack of crates, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He could hear the panicked shouts, the thunder of boots on the boardwalk, the brutal, efficient language of a robbery in progress. 3 men, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, herded the bank teller and 2 customers into the street. A 4th man, clearly the leader, emerged, last a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He was tall, confident in his violence, moving with a predator's coiled grace. Elias watched through the dusty storefront window, a silent observer, to a scene he knew all too well. He would let them pass. They were not his trouble. His life was here now in the quiet anonymity of fixing fences and stocking shelves. The leader stopped in the middle of the street, surveying his work. He adjusted the bandana over his face, and then, in a voice that was clear and loud enough to carry across the dusty expanse, he bellowed a strange, triumphant phrase. Time to pay the devil his due. The words were a key turning in the locked room of Elias's past. His blood went cold. It was a line from an old book of fables their mother used to read to him and Samuel on cold winter nights. A silly, dramatic phrase Samuel had adopted as his own, shouting it before every boyhood adventure, every reckless stunt. A phrase Elias hadn't heard in 10 years, not since the day he'd put his brother in the ground. It had to be a coincidence, a cruel, impossible fluke of fate. But then the robber raised his pistol, firing a shot into the sky to scatter the gathering onlookers. The sun glinted off the weapon, and Elias's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a standard issue Colt or a Remington. It was a Peacemaker, its barrel and frame gleaming with intricate silver inlay. And there, carved into the worn walnut grip, was the unmistakable shape of a snarling wolf's head. Samuel's gun. The one-of-a-kind pistol Elias had commissioned for his brother's 18th birthday. The very same gun he had placed in Samuel's cold, still hands before covering him with earth and stones. The promise made over that grave shattered like the bank window. The past wasn't a locked room. It was a hungry wolf, and it had just kicked down his door. The ghost, named Miller, died in that moment, and Elias Vance, a man who had buried his own soul, was resurrected by the impossible sight of his brother's gun in a dead man's hand. The robbers mounted their horses, their laughter echoing through the terrified town as they spurred their mounts and galloped away, swallowed by a cloud of their own dust. Elias didn't move. He simply stood in the shadows of the general store, the world narrowing to a single burning point of focus. He had to know. The quiet life he had built for himself was a lie, and the only truth that mattered was riding away into the desert. The immediate aftermath of the robbery was a symphony of chaos. Doors creaked open as townsfolk emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary posture suggested he carried the weight of the whole territory on his stooped shoulders, was trying to restore order, his voice a gravelly monotone against the panicked chatter. "Everyone stay back, Jed. Check on Mr. Abernathy. Martha, see to Mrs. Gable, she took a fall." Elias stepped out of the general store, the sudden sunlight blinding him. He blinked his eyes, adjusting, and the world came back into sharp focus. The splintered doorframe of the bank, the glittering shards of glass on the street, the dark, accusing emptiness where the town's meager savings had been. He walked toward the scene, his movements deliberate, his face an unreadable mask. Miller Sheriff Brody grunted, acknowledging him with a nod. "You see which way they went?" West Elias said, his voice a dry rasp he barely recognized. "4 riders. Moving fast." "Damn vultures," Brody muttered, kicking at a spent shell casing. "Knew the payroll shipment arrived this morning. This was planned." He looked at the faces of the small crowd gathering around him. Ranchers whose savings were gone, merchants whose credit was now worthless. Redemption had been bleeding out for years, and the railroad was supposed to be the tourniquet. This robbery felt like a mortal wound. Just then, a sleek, black buggy pulled up, drawn by 2 perfectly matched gray horses. The man who stepped out was the stark opposite of Sheriff Brody's worn-down reality. Silas Kane was the town's polished future. He was handsome, dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that somehow managed to look clean, even in the perpetual dust of redemption. His smile was bright and reassuring, his voice a smooth balm on the town's raw nerves. "Sheriff, my God, is everyone all right?" Kane asked, his eyes sweeping the crowd with an expression of deep concern. He was the chief representative of the Transcontinental Railroad, the man selling them their salvation. "Shaken, Mr. Kane." "But alive," Brody said, his tone lacking Kane's practiced warmth. "They cleaned us out. Every last dollar." Kane's face fell into a mask of theatrical dismay. He stepped onto the boardwalk, placing a comforting hand on the shoulder of a distraught shopkeeper. "This is a tragedy. A despicable act of cowardice against good, hard-working people." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice so all could hear. "But do not despair. This act of barbarism will not deter us. Progress will not be stopped by thugs and thieves. The railroad is coming, and with it, prosperity and security. I will personally wire our head office in St. Louis. I will match a portion of the stolen funds from my own pocket to ensure the bank remains solvent until this crisis is past." A murmur of relief and gratitude rippled through the crowd. Kane was their savior, a man of wealth and vision, who saw not a dying town, but a future hub of commerce. He was hope in a tailored suit. Elias watched him unmoved by the performance. He saw the way Kane's eyes, a shade of pale, calculating blue, lingered for a moment too long on the frightened faces. He saw the way his smile never quite reached them. Elias had known men like Kane before, men who could charm a bird from a tree and then wring its neck without a second thought. While Kane spoke of progress, Elias's gaze drifted to the 2 grim-faced men standing beside Kane's buggy. They were not railroad men. They were hard cases, their hands resting near the butts of their pistols, their eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. Hired muscle. Later that evening, as the sun surrendered to the horizon and bled purple shadows into the alleyways, Elias went to the livery. He saddled his horse, a tough buckskin gelding, with quiet efficiency. He packed light a bedroll, a canteen jerky, and ammunition. "Riding out?" Miller, a voice asked from the doorway. It was Sheriff Brody, his face etched with the day's exhaustion. "Just for a few days," Elias lied. "Thought I'd check some trap lines up in the mesas." Brody walked closer, the scent of stale coffee and cheap cigars clinging to him. He leaned against a stall, his eyes studying Elias in the lantern light. "You know, for a quiet man, you have very watchful eyes. I saw you today during the robbery. You weren't scared. You were still, like a man waiting for something." He paused. "I also saw you watching Kane. He's got this town eating out of his hand." "He says what they want to hear," Elias said, cinching the saddle tight. "That he does." Brody agreed. "Look, Miller, I don't know who you are or what you're running from. Most everyone out here is running from something. But those men who hit the bank today were professionals. They're not some farm boys who got lucky. This is dangerous country. A man could get lost out there checking trap lines." It was a warning offered with a sliver of genuine concern. "I can take care of myself," Sheriff Elias said, his voice low and final. He led the horse out into the cool night air. The town was quiet now, a wounded animal licking its sores in the dark. But Elias wasn't thinking about the town or the stolen money. He was thinking about a silver-inlaid colt and a ghost's catchphrase. He swung into the saddle, the worn leather creaking like a familiar whisper. He was no longer Miller the handyman. He was Elias Vance, brother to a dead man, and he was going hunting. He spurred his horse west, riding into the vast, dark expanse of the desert, chasing a phantom from a decade-old grave. The desert at night was a different world. The oppressive heat of the day gave way to a deceptive chill that sank into a man's bones. The landscape, a sun-bleached canvas of brown and red by day, transformed into a shifting tapestry of silver and black under the cold light of the moon. Elias rode with a grim purpose, his eyes scanning the ground. The trail left by the four riders was plain enough for now, a churned-up scar on the hardpan earth. They were riding hard, confident they weren't being followed. That was their first mistake. Elias had learned to track before he'd learned to write. His father had taught him to read the land as if it were a book, a broken twig, a displaced stone, the depth of a hoofprint in the sand. But it was Samuel who had turned it into an art form. Samuel, with his restless energy and uncanny instincts, could follow a trail that had gone cold for days. "You look with your eyes, Eli." He used to say, a teasing grin on his face. "I look with my gut." The memory was a sharp pang in his chest, a pain he had learned to live with, like a poorly set bone that ached with the changing weather. He pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. The robbers were heading northwest toward the broken mountainous country of the Dragoon, range a perfect place to disappear. For 2 days he followed. He moved like a wraith, eating in the saddle, resting for only a few hours at a time, when the trail became too difficult to read in the dark. He was a patient hunter, letting his prey think they were safe, letting them grow careless. On the second day, the terrain changed the flat desert floor, giving way to rolling foothills dotted with mesquite and palo verde. Here, the trail split. 3 sets of tracks continued northwest. One broke off, heading due to south, toward a small isolated ranch nestled in a box canyon. Elias considered. The main group was the prize, but the lone rider was an opportunity. A chance for answers without the risk of a 4-to-1 fight. He turned his horse south, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt Navy. The feeling of the cold steel under his palm was an unwelcome familiarity, a ghost of a life he thought he'd escaped. The ranch was little more than a dilapidated shack and a crude corral surrounded by land that was little more than rock and scrub. A thin plume of smoke rose from a stone chimney. As Elias drew closer, he dismounted, tethering his horse in a cluster of boulders, and continuing on foot, his boots making no sound on the rocky ground. He crept to the edge of the clearing and watched. A single horse, lathered and tired, stood in the corral. A man was at the water trough, splashing his face. It was one of the robbers, a stocky man with a thick, untamed beard. Elias weighted his body perfectly still, his mind a cold, clear slate. The man finished drinking, then turned and headed for the shack. That was his moment. Elias moved with a speed that belied his quiet nature. He crossed the 50 yards of open ground in a silent rush. He was on the man, and before he even reached the door, the barrel of his navy pressed hard against the base of the man's skull. "Don't move. Don't even breathe loud," Elias whispered, his voice a chilling rasp. The man froze, his body rigid with shock. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a man asking questions," Elias said. He disarmed the robber, taking a Colt from his holster and a knife from his belt. "The gun your leader was carrying. Silver inlay wolf's head on the grip. Where did he get it?" The robber let out a shaky, incredulous laugh. "You tracked me all the way out here for a damn pistol." Elias pressed the barrel harder against his skull. "Where?" "I don't know," the man stammered. "Belongs to the boss. He's had it long as I've known him. Now get that thing off me." And the phrase he shouted, Elias, continued, his voice dangerously low. "Time to pay the devil his due." "What does it mean?" "It's just something he says, a motto, I guess. Means it's time to get what's coming to us. Now I gave you your answers. Let me go." The answers were nothing. They told him nothing. Frustration burned in Elias's gut. He shoved the man toward the shack. "Inside. Let's see who you've been bothering out here." Inside the shack was sparse and squalid. An old man with a face like a dried-up riverbed sat tied to a chair, a fresh bruise swelling on his cheek. A woman, presumably his wife, lay weeping on a cot in the corner. "Let them go," the old rancher said, his voice weak but defiant. "Our business is with you." Elias ignored him, his eyes fixed on the robber. "What's your business here?" "Just delivering a message," the robber sneered, his confidence returning now that the gun wasn't at his head. "The old fool won't sell. Mr. Kane wants this land. He always gets what he wants." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Silas Kane, the town's savior, the man of progress. It all clicked into place. The perfectly timed robbery, the well-equipped men, the targeted intimidation. Kane wasn't building a railroad. He was conquering a territory. The robbers were his army. "So Kane is your boss?" Elias asked, a cold certainty dawning on him. "He pays the bills," the man said with a shrug. "Pays well." Suddenly, the robber lunged, a desperate, foolish move. He grabbed for the rifle, leaning against the wall. Elias didn't hesitate. He moved with fluid, brutal efficiency, a muscle memory from a darker time. He sidestepped the charge, brought the heavy barrel of his pistol down hard on the man's temple. The robber collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Elias turned to the old couple, cutting their bonds with the robber's knife. "Are you all right?" The old man rubbed his chafed wrists, his eyes studying Elias with a weary wisdom. "He said his boss wants our water rights. Said the railroad needs the creek." He looked around his small, poor home. "This is all we have. We were here long before any railroad." "You need to leave," Elias said, his tone urgent. "They'll be back. Go to the sheriff in Redemption. Tell him what happened. Tell him Silas Kane sent this man." The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. "They'll kill us." "They'll kill you if you stay," Elias countered. He helped them gather a few meager belongings, gave them all the jerky he had left. As they prepared to leave, the old man paused and looked at Elias. "Who are you?" Elias hesitated. "Just a man passing through." He watched them ride away, until they were a small speck against the vast landscape. He was alone again in the silent shack with the unconscious robber, and a truth that was darker and more tangled than he could have imagined. This was no longer just about his brother's gun. It was about a sickness that had taken root in the heart of redemption, a sickness with a charming smile and a politician's voice. He knew he couldn't face Kane's entire operation alone. He needed leverage. He needed proof. He returned to redemption under the cover of darkness, a ghost slipping back into the town that thought him a simple handyman. He avoided the main street, circling around to the back of the hotel where Kane kept a suite of rooms on the top floor. He had a new plan, a reckless one. If Kane was the source of this rot, then Elias would cut it out at the root. He was going to search Kane's rooms. Getting in was easy. A lifetime of practice made him adept at climbing drain pipes and slipping through unlocked windows. Kane's suite was opulent, a stark contrast to the rest of the town. Velvet curtains, a mahogany desk, crystal glasses. The air smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. He worked quickly, his senses on high alert. He searched the desk first. Contracts for land purchases, all for pennies on the dollar. Letters from railroad executives in St. Louis, and a map of the territory with the proposed railroad line drawn in thick red ink. But something was wrong. The line bypassed Redemption by a good 20 miles, heading straight through the valley where the old rancher lived, and several other properties Kane was pressuring. The railroad was never coming to Redemption. It was all a lie, a smokescreen to cover a massive land grab. But there was still no connection to the robbery, nothing to tie Kane to his thugs. Elias was about to give up when he noticed a small, out-of-place scuff mark on the floor near a heavy bookshelf. He ran his fingers along the books and then along the frame. A slight indentation. He pushed. A section of the bookshelf swung inward with a soft click, revealing a hidden safe. It was an old iron model. Elias had opened dozens like it in his youth. He knelt, his ear pressed against the cold metal, his fingers working the dial with a delicate touch. The tumblers fell into place, one by one, soft, satisfying clicks in the silent room. The heavy door swung open. Inside was a leather satchel containing a large sum of cash, far more than Kane should have on hand. Bundles of bills, some of which were bound with paper from the Redemption Bank. The stolen money. This was the proof he needed. But beneath the satchel was something else. A small, locked wooden box. He pried it open with his knife. The contents made the hair on his arms stand on end. There was a faded newspaper clipping the headline, yellowed with age. Vance Gang Massacre. Family of 4 killed in brutal raid at Clearwater Creek. Beside it was a child's drawing, a crude, horrifying depiction of a farmhouse engulfed in flames, with stick figures lying on the ground. And at the bottom of the box, a tarnished silver locket. Elias's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, a man with kind eyes and a woman with a gentle smile. He remembered their faces. He remembered the smell of smoke, the sound of his brother's drunken laughter, the woman's screams. It was the last job the Vance brothers ever pulled, the one that had shattered everything. He dug deeper into the box, his heart pounding. He found a folded, brittle property deed. The name on it was not Kane. It was Kincaid. The Kincaid family. And then it hit him, a revelation so profound, so horrifying, that it stole the air from his lungs. Silas Kane was Silas Kincaid. The charming businessman was the little boy who had survived the fire, the sole survivor of the massacre at Clearwater Creek. The railroad was a lie. The land grab was a means to an end. The bank robbery, Samuel's gun, the catchphrase, it was all a meticulously crafted trap. A ghost story designed to lure one specific phantom out of hiding. Kane's revenge wasn't for the town. It was for him. It had always been for him. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Elias snapped out of his trance. He shoved the contents back in the box, grabbed the satchel of money, and slipped back toward the window. He was halfway across the roof when the door to Kane's suite burst open. He was here. Kane's voice roared, filled with a fury that was anything but charming. "Find him. I want him alive." Elias didn't wait. He leapt from the hotel roof to the one next door, landing in a crouch. Gunshots erupted behind him, bullets whining past his head. He scrambled across the rooftops of the sleeping town, the heavy satchel of stolen money thumping against his back. He had walked into Kane's parlor, and the spider had just revealed himself. This was no longer a hunt for answers. It was a war between two ghosts, and redemption was their battlefield. The escape from redemption was a desperate, chaotic flight. Elias dropped from the rooftops into a dark alleyway, the sounds of shouting and running footsteps echoing from the main street. Kane's men were fanning out their orders clear. He made it to the livery, his breath coming in ragged bursts, and the satchel of money a heavy, damning weight. He threw it over his saddle horn, mounted his buckskin, and burst out of the stable doors, firing 2 shots from his navy into the air to scatter the men converging on his position. He galloped out of town, the shouts and gunshots fading behind him. He didn't slow down until the lights of redemption were a faint, hazy glow in the distance. He had the proof, the stolen money that tied Kane directly to the robbery. But he also had a far more dangerous burden, the truth. He rode through the night, pushing his horse to its limit. He found refuge in a shallow cave carved into the side of a mesa as the first hint of dawn stained the eastern sky. He was exhausted, but sleep was an impossible luxury. He sat by the mouth of the cave, the satchel on his lap, and re-examined the contents of the wooden box which he had stuffed into his saddlebags. The drawing of the burning farmhouse seemed to mock him in the pale morning light. He had tried to stop it. That's what he told himself, the same lie he had polished for 10 years until it shone like truth. He had argued with Samuel before the raid. The Kincaid farm was too small, the family too poor to be worth the risk. But Samuel, flush with whiskey and arrogance, wouldn't listen. "We're the Vance brothers," he'd slurred, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "We take what we want." The raid had gone wrong from the start. Mr. Kincaid had come out with a shotgun. Samuel, drunk and enraged, had shot him down. The rest was a blur of fire and screaming. Elias remembered pulling Samuel away from the flames, the heat searing his skin, his brother laughing a wild, terrifying sound. That night, something inside Elias had broken. 2 days later, during a heated argument over the massacre Samuel had drawn on him, Elias had been faster. He'd shot his own brother a shot to the leg, meant to disarm, not to kill. But the wound had festered, and the whiskey had done the rest. Samuel had died of a fever a week later, cursing Elias with his final breath. Elias had buried him along with his gun and his name, and walked away. A man haunted by the monster his brother had become, and the part he himself had played. And now, the son of the man Samuel murdered was here pulling the strings, orchestrating a grand, terrible symphony of revenge. Elias knew he couldn't go to the law. Not yet. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but he was one man against Kane's wealth and influence. Kane would paint Elias as the thief, a known outlaw from a family of killers. It would be Elias's word against the town's benefactor. He needed more. He needed to turn Kane's own game against him. He spent the day hidden in the cave planning. Kane would be hunting him, using his hired guns to scour the countryside. But Kane didn't just want him dead. The elaborate setup with the gun and the catchphrase proved that. He wanted Elias to suffer. He wanted to strip away everything from him, just as the Vance brothers had stripped away everything from the Kincaids. This realization gave Elias a sliver of an advantage. Cain would escalate. He would make a mistake. As dusk fell, a new plan formed in Elias's mind. He couldn't hide forever. He had to go back, not to the town itself, but to its people. The ranchers Cain was displacing were the key. They were victims just like him. Their stories combined with the stolen money would be a weapon even Cain couldn't defeat. He started with the old rancher he had saved, the one whose last name he didn't even know. He found the couple taking shelter in an abandoned line shack, miles from their home. They were terrified, but when Elias showed them the satchel of money and explained Cain's deception about the railroad, then their fear began to turn to a hard, cold anger. The rancher's name was Peterson. He told Elias of others, the Jacksons, whose well had been poisoned, the Garzas, whose cattle had been rustled. Cain's men had been waging a quiet war of terror across the valley. For the next week, Elias became a ghost of a different sort. He moved from ranch to ranch under the cover of darkness, a messenger of truth. He met with families who had been bullied and threatened people who had been forced to sell their heritage for a pittance. He showed them the map proving Cain's lie about the railroad's route. He didn't tell them who he was, the name Vance would only sow fear, but presented himself as a man who had also been wronged by Cain. He was uniting them, forging their individual grievances into a collective resolve. He also found an unlikely source of information in Sarah, the daughter of the blacksmith in Redemption. He'd met her a few times when he was still miller, fixing her father's forge. She was quiet with intelligent eyes that saw more than most. Elias approached her one night on the outskirts of town. He didn't tell her everything, just that Cain was not what he seemed. He asked her to be his eyes and ears. Wary at first, she agreed, her own suspicions about the town's charming savior giving weight to Elias's words. It was Sarah who sent him the urgent message. She left a signal, a blue cloth tied to a fence post on the edge of town. Elias met her in their prearranged spot, a grove of cottonwoods by a dried-up creek. Her face was pale with fear. "It's Cain," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He knows the ranchers are talking. He knows someone is organizing them. He's getting desperate." This afternoon, he and his men rode out to the Peterson place. They took Mr. Peterson. They said he was being arrested for conspiring to damage railroad property. "It's a lie. Brody wouldn't arrest him without cause," Elias said. "It wasn't Sheriff Brody," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "It was Cain and his own men. They're holding him somewhere. People are saying Cain is going to make an example of him." Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was the escalation he had been waiting for. Cain was done with subtlety. He was moving to crush the resistance before it could fully form. But it was also a trap. Cain knew that the mysterious organizer Elias would not abandon the old man. "Where did they take him?" Elias asked. "I heard one of the men talking," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "He mentioned the old Devil's Maw mine up in the Dragoons." The Devil's Maw, an abandoned silver mine notorious for its instability and treacherous tunnels, a place where a man could disappear forever. "Thank you, Sarah. You've done more than enough. Now you need to stay away from this. It's going to get dangerous," Elias told her. He turned to leave, but she grabbed his arm. "You're going after him alone, aren't you? Against all of them?" "I have to," Elias said simply. "Let me help," she insisted. "My father has dynamite for clearing rock at the smithy. You might need it." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and saw a strength he hadn't expected. He was a man who had spent a decade alone, trusting no one. But here in the dust of Arizona, he had found allies. He gave a single reluctant nod. As he rode toward the mountains, a massive storm was gathering on the horizon, the clouds churning black and bruised. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. It was a fitting backdrop for what was to come. Cain had chosen the location well a tomb for his secrets. But Elias was no stranger to tombs. He had been living in one for 10 years. Tonight, he would either bury Silas Cain in another one or join his brother in the dust. The entrance to the Devil's Maw was a dark, jagged wound in the side of the mountain. By the time Elias arrived, the storm had broken with savage fury. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and lightning ripped across the sky, momentarily illuminating the skeletal remains of the mine's headframe. Thunder cannonaded through the canyons, a sound like the mountains themselves were groaning in agony. Elias dismounted, leaving his horse in a sheltered overhang. He had the satchel of money, a bundle of dynamite sticks from Sarah's father, and his guns. He crept toward the entrance, the roar of the storm masking any sound he made. 2 of Cain's men stood guard just inside the mine tunnel, their shapes silhouetted by the flickering light of a lantern. He couldn't risk a gunfight. Not yet. He circled around, climbing the slick, treacherous rocks above the entrance. From his perch, he could see deeper into the main tunnel. It opened into a larger cavern where another lantern cast long, dancing shadows. He saw Silas Cain, and beside him, tied to a thick support timber, was the old rancher Peterson. Elias worked quickly. He took 1 stick of dynamite, cut the fuse short, and lit it with a lucifer shielded against the wind. He tossed it not at the guards, but onto the scree slope beside them. The explosion was deafening, a sharp crack that was swallowed by a much larger roar as tons of rock and earth cascaded down, completely blocking the mine entrance. He had just sealed himself inside the tomb with his enemy. He scrambled down and entered through a secondary ventilation shaft he'd spotted from above. The air inside was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet stone and decay. He moved through the narrow side tunnels, a phantom in the labyrinth. Water dripped from the ceiling, a sound like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of his life, or Cain's. Vance Cain's voice echoed through the tunnels, magnified and distorted. He sounded calm, almost cheerful. "I knew you'd come. I must admit your ability to rally the local peasantry is impressive. You have your father's knack for populism, it seems." Elias remained silent, pressing himself against the cold rock wall. He could hear Cain's men searching their voices, and the scrape of their boots echoing closer. "You think sealing the entrance has trapped me?" Cain's laugh bounced off the walls. "Oh no. It has trapped us. A private reunion. Just you, me, and the ghosts of Clearwater Creek." Elias moved deeper, using the confusing network of tunnels to circle around behind the main cavern. He came up on a ledge overlooking the scene. Cain stood by the fire, his handsome face illuminated from below, looking like a demon in the flickering light. Peterson was slumped against the post, conscious but weak. 2 of Cain's thugs were searching the tunnels. 2 more stood guard near their boss. You see, Vance Cain continued his monologue, his voice resonating with a mad theatricality. This was never about the railroad. It was never about the money. It was about justice, the kind of justice the law can't provide. It's about a little boy who hid under his bed and watched his world burn. A boy who smelled the smoke and heard the screams and listened to your brother laughing. The word hung in the cavern, more chilling than the damp air. "I heard him," Cain whispered, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed grief. He was drunk, a monster with a boy's face. He set the fire. And you stood there, his brother, his keeper, and you did nothing. I tried to stop him. Elias's voice came from the darkness of the ledge, startling Cain and his men. He stepped into the edge of the light, his Colt Navy steady in his hand. That night and every day before it. You can't stop a man who's determined to become a devil. Cain stared up at him, his face a mask of incandescent rage. Excuses, you were a Vance. You rode with him. You shared the blood money. You are just as guilty. I am Elias, said his voice heavy with an admission that was 10 years overdue. He looked at Peterson, then back at Cain. But this isn't justice. This is just more hate. Let the old man go, Cain. Your fight is with me. Oh, our fight is just beginning. Cain sneered. Kill him. The 2 guards below opened fire, their shots echoing like cannons in the enclosed space. Elias fired back, dropping one of the men while the other scrambled for cover. The other 2 thugs came running from the tunnels, firing wildly. Elias was pinned down. He pulled back from the ledge, lit the fuse on another stick of dynamite, and tossed it down into the center of the cavern. The explosion was immense. The cavern filled with smoke and the roar of falling rock. A support beam splintered and cracked. The entire mine groaned. In the chaos, Elias slid down a pile of rubble to the cavern floor. He ran to Peterson, cutting his ropes with his knife. Get to the back tunnels. Find a place to hide, he yelled over the ringing in his ears. The old man scrambled away into the darkness. Elias turned back to face the smoke. A figure emerged, coughing. It was Cain, a deep gash on his forehead, his fine suit torn and covered in dust. He held Samuel's silver-inlaid peacemaker in his hand. Just you and me now, Vance, Cain rasped. The final confrontation began. It wasn't a clean gunfight. It was a desperate, brutal brawl in the collapsing mine. They wrestled for control, their fists flying, their bodies slamming against the rock walls. The structural integrity of the mine was failing, groaning under the strain of the explosion. Dust rained down from the ceiling. As they fought, Cain gasped out one final poisonous truth. Do you want to know the real joke, Elias? The part I saved for my nightmares, when you tried to stop Samuel, when you fought with him in the yard, he wasn't just drunk. He was angry at you. He said you were getting soft. He said the fire was to prove to you that he still had iron in his spine. He burned my family alive for you. Elias. Their deaths were a gift to his big brother. The revelation struck Elias harder than any physical blow. It reframed his entire guilt. His brother hadn't just lost his way. He had murdered a family out of a twisted sense of loyalty and rebellion against the very morality Elias was trying to pull him back toward. His memory of Samuel, the beloved, reckless younger brother, crumbled, replaced by the image of a monster he had helped create. The ground shuddered violently. A huge section of the ceiling collapsed, separating them. Cain was trapped on the other side, his leg pinned by a fallen beam. The silver Colt lay on the ground, just out of his reach. Vance, he screamed, his voice filled with terror and rage. Don't leave me. Don't you leave me here. Elias stood there, his chest heaving, his face bleeding. He looked at the man who had orchestrated his ruin, the boy whose life he had destroyed. He saw the same fear in Cain's eyes that he must have seen in Mr. Kincaid's. He picked up Samuel's gun. He could end it. One shot and the ghosts would be silent. But he didn't. He looked at the gun, this cursed piece of silver and walnut, and saw not a weapon, but a legacy of pain. He tucked it into his belt. He turned his back on the screaming trapped man and walked toward the sound of Peterson's calls from a side tunnel. He had found another way out, a narrow crawl space leading to the surface. As he and the old man climbed toward the storm-lashed sky, the Devil's Maw mine gave one final terrible groan and collapsed entirely, burying Silas Cain and his all-consuming hatred forever. Elias Vance emerged into the rain-swept dawn, a man reborn from the earth. He was wounded and exhausted, but for the first time in a decade, he was not running. He had faced his past, and though it had nearly buried him, he had survived. The journey back to redemption was slow and arduous. Elias, leaning on Peterson for support, was a specter of his former self. When they arrived, the town was in an uproar. News of the explosion at the mine and the disappearance of Silas Kane had already spread. Elias didn't hide. He walked directly to the sheriff's office, the heavy satchel of stolen money in one hand and Samuel's silver-inlaid Colt in the other. He placed them both on Sheriff Brody's desk. The office was crowded with concerned townspeople, including Sarah, whose face was a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Miller, or whoever you are." Brody set his eyes wide. What in God's name happened out there? In a low, steady voice, Elias told them everything. He started with the robbery and Kane's deception using the money and the land grant map as proof. Peterson corroborated the story of his kidnapping and the terror Kane's men had inflicted. The townspeople listened, their initial shock turning to cold fury as they realized how thoroughly they had been duped. But Elias didn't stop there. He took a deep breath and confessed the rest. He told them his real name was Elias Vance. He told them about his family, about the massacre at Clearwater Creek, and about Silas Kane's true identity as the vengeful survivor, Silas Kincaid. He laid the sins of his past bare for the entire town to see, accepting the weight of their judgment. He did not ask for forgiveness, only for understanding. A tense silence filled the room when he finished. He had saved them from Kane, but he was also the monster from their nightmares, an outlaw, a killer. Sheriff Brody stared at him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. He picked up the silver Colt, turning it over in his hands. "So this is what started it all," he said quietly. He looked from Elias's tired, honest face to the faces of the ranchers he had united. He saw Peterson alive and well. He saw the returned money that would save their town. "The man who tried to destroy this town is dead." Brody declared, his voice firm. "The man who saved it is standing right here." He looked directly at Elias. "There's a federal warrant out of Wyoming for an Elias Vance 10 years old. But you know what? From the description, it doesn't look a thing like you." He dropped the warrant paper into a trash bin. "As far as I'm concerned, a man named Miller helped this town recover its stolen property. And that's the end of it." It wasn't a pardon, but something more meaningful, a second chance. The threat to redemption was over. With Kane's conspiracy exposed, the real railroad surveyors came, and seeing the town's unified spirit, they agreed to renegotiate the route. Elias used a portion of the recovered money, his share he'd called it, to help the displaced ranchers buy back their land and rebuild. He stayed not as Miller the handyman, but as Elias Vance, a man with a past, working to build a future. He didn't hide from his name anymore. He worked to redefine it. Months later, when the first green shoots of spring pushed through the desert soil, Elias rode out alone. He traveled for days back into the desolate country where he had started his long run from the past. He found the place a lonely pile of rocks under a solitary wind-twisted juniper tree, Samuel's grave. He dismounted and stood before the unmarked plot for a long time. There was no anger left, no burning guilt. Just a profound, quiet sorrow for the brother he had loved and the monster he had lost. He pulled the silver-inlaid Colt Peacemaker from his belt. The sunlight gleamed on the intricate scrollwork, the snarling wolf on the grip seeming to mock him. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, a symbol of all the violence, pain, and twisted love that had defined his life. He knelt and placed the gun gently on the pile of rocks, leaving it to be claimed by the sun and the dust. It was the last ghost of his old life, and he was finally letting it go. He stood up, turned his back on the grave without a second glance, and began to walk. His horse followed, its reins trailing in the dirt. He headed east, back toward the distant silhouette of a town called Redemption, not as a gunslinger or a fugitive or a ghost, but simply as a man walking toward home.